Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
Should you pay $170 for a Predator takedown model? Let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Adidas Predator 26 Pro FT, the first takedown model in the new Pred 26 lineup that retails for a whopping $110 less than the top-end Elite model. However, despite the huge price discrepancy, it features a very similar upper material, NanoStrike Pro instead of NanoStrike Plus. It does, however, strip away all rubber elements, where on the Pro model, it's simply just a gritty texturing. However, it does change up the heel design in a way that I think a lot of people wanted to see on that top-end Elite model, and the strike frame sole plate along with the power spine, despite not having that wearable shiny finish that does admittedly look quite cool, from a construction perspective, this feels almost identical to that of the top-end model. Meaning that in more ways than one, these share a lot in common with the top model, which of course calls into question whether or not those are actually worth the $110 extra, but also $170 is still not cheap, and for in and around $200, which is crazy to say that that is now a mid-range price point football boot, there are lots of excellent options. So with that in mind, we're gonna go over the good and the bad of the Pred 26 Pro, take a look at how they fit and feel on feet, talk about whether or not these actually qualify as real Predators based on the characteristics that Adidas have changed around with this new model, and ultimately conclude whether or not you should be spending $170 on these or on something else entirely. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you guys enjoy the content on the channel, perhaps want to see more takedown model reviews, don't forget to drop a like on this one. And if you appreciate the unsugar-coated, unsponsored, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2026. Where first things first, I just wanted to give a quick side-by-side with the Pro and the Elite just to show how similar looking these two football boots are, where of course up close you can see some of the minor differences between them, but honestly from 10, 20 feet away, you would have a really hard time telling these two apart. With the main reason for the visual similarity being the fact that they are also physically very similar to the Elite model, where like I said, instead of NanoStrike Plus, you have NanoStrike Pro, which is still a mesh-based synthetic material that I would say is maybe even a smidge thinner, which also results in it feeling slightly more pliable, especially straight out of the box. But from a construction standpoint, even seeing the micro texturing of the mesh mid layer on the surface, I really can't say that there is actually a big difference here other than some of the micro texturing on the surface, of which it's actually more dense around the toe box and forefoot area on the Pro than it is on the Elite, where it's a little bit more broken up. So in terms of micro texture, you might actually be getting more of it on this model, but it doesn't really result in that big of a difference in terms of grip on the ball and general feel. Even the little cutouts through the midfoot are still present on the Pro model, and internally, the way that the lining works and the reinforcement, it's all pretty well the same. So it really does feel like Adidas have done the bare minimum to make this different from the Elites to justify calling it NanoStrike Pro rather than just keeping the same NanoStrike Plus material as the top-end model, which is more or less what they did with the previous generation. Both the Elites and the Pro had Hybrid Touch 2.0. They've just chosen to give it a different name this time around, but have more or less still done the exact same thing. Which is a good thing in the sense that you are getting what Adidas has deemed to be a top-end upper on the first tier takedown model, but it's also maybe not a good thing in the sense that this is the new Predator. And as far as Predator uppers go, this is as thin as the Pred has ever been. Basically, think of a barefoot feeling speed boot synthetic upper with no extra padding, no real softness, and generally a stiffer, more structured feel across the entire foot, where if you liked the little bit of softness you got from Hybrid Touch 2.0, that is more or less completely gone with this new Pred 26. Speaking of something else that is completely gone on the Pro model in particular, if you look closely at the Predator elements highlighted in white, like it would be on the Elite, you have some micro texture within the stripes running through the midfoot, but then as you get into the striking area, it just continues as being a micro texture all the way through. There is no physical rubber on the Pro model whatsoever, which is a major downgrade in the sense that on last year's Pro model, we did still get rubber striking elements that were admittedly a little bit different from the Elites, but at least you still got that signature Predator feel from the takedown model variation. But on this boot in particular, if you look at how clean the edges are for these stripes right here and then these three pods, these ones are normally made from rubber. Look how they're filled in and kind of just painted over to give it the look and appearance. It's almost as if they were going to put rubber here at one point or another, but instead at the last minute, they just decided to paint them in, and it's just all very sloppy until you get to, again, the graphics that wouldn't normally be rubber, at which point it gets much sharper again. All of which is purely cosmetic and has nothing to do with performance, but again, for $170, why don't they all look sharp? Looks aside though, it's just super disappointing that you're not getting rubber elements on a $170 Predator model. In other words, in terms of additional grip on the ball, especially this being classified as a control boot, you're getting micro texture through the forefoot and toe box area. You're getting some micro texture across the top of the foot, and then you're getting very minor micro texture within the white elements scattered across the striking area of the foot, as well as the inside of the midfoot, all of which adds a little bit of additional grip on the ball because of the grittiness of the texture itself. But in terms of giving you that sticky bite, especially in the striking area of the foot that you expect from a higher end Predator model, again, these are pushing nearly $200, there is none of that to be had here from the Predator 26 Pro FT, which in my opinion, no extra grip and a super thin upper really makes these feel way more like an F50 than they do a Predator. In fact, if they didn't have this tongue and elastic strap, there's really nothing about this football boot other than the way that it looks that really ties it to any core Predator DNA. Where speaking of the tongue, it is very similar again to that of the Elite model. It's just missing some of the micro texturing on the surface that, again, really doesn't do much of anything at all. It's held down by an elastic strap that doesn't have the extra detailing and reinforcement, meaning that this one is a little bit easier to stretch and therefore probably a little bit less durable, but as long as you're playing on decent pitches, that should not be much of an issue. It has the same kind of polyurethane top layer finish on the top side of the tongue, but then the underside is that really soft microfiber that basically makes up the main body of the standalone tongue itself, where this boot does still maintain a more traditional U-throat construction with a standalone tongue. The laces are pushed slightly to the lateral side, but for the most part remain pretty central, with the tongue itself just having this nice padding to it, very similar to what we saw on the previous generation, and easily the softest element of this particular football boot. And also, just like the Elites, if I loosen the laces, you can see that they've kind of extended the wings towards the upper side of the tongue to wrap a little bit more along the side of your foot, because when you put these on and tie the laces tight, it was very common on the previous two generations to have a little bit of a gap, or at least have the tongue not fill in the gap quite as nicely as you would want it to, which would leave for a little bit of uncomfortable lace bite along the sides, and also not have the tongue really secure where it could kind of slide from side to side. With these new expanded wings, it does a really good job of helping to hold the tongue in place and generally just feel more comfortable across the top of the foot. So I do like that change. Although, even though I really do like the tongue and I think it's such an important visual aspect of the Predator series as a whole, when you make the upper as thin as they have on this new Pred 26 and then have what is easily the thickest, most padded section of the upper in the form of a giant fold over tongue that really does nothing other than cover up the laces, it does stand out as the most bulky part of the upper by a long shot, just because of how kind of out of place it is on what, like I said, feels very much like a thin synthetic speed boot. Moving to the rear, you're going to find that the Pred Pro maintains a low cut construction, which you'll see across the entire Pred 26 line, and it features a design that is more or less kind of an upgraded variation of what we had on the Predator 25 Pro, where something that a lot of people really wanted to see, including myself, on the Elite model was a stitch and turn heel, which is effectively what they've given us here. You have the external heel counter as part of the strike frame sole plate, which is something that we've never really had on an Adidas takedown model, so that's pretty cool to see. No real structure to this back part, which again is not dissimilar to that of the top end model, but then you can see you have this really soft microfiber material lining the back of the heel as well as the sides of the ankle, with plenty of padding all the way through. Granted, more of the padding is targeted higher up rather than down low. Nonetheless, there's more padding here than what you'll find on the Elite model, and in general, I do think that this does feel better. However, for $170, it's nowhere near as good as, again, other Adidas football boots. With the Copa Icon 2 in particular being the boot that comes to mind, very similar low cut construction to that of this Pred Pro. However, this design, the heel liner, the fit, the shaping, this I think is one of the best heel designs in football boots that are currently available. So the fact that this is nowhere near what you can get for just $10 more in the Copa Icon 2 is, at least in my opinion, a little bit disappointing. And I will also say, as much as I do think this design is better than what you'll find on the Elite, there is still some really hard parts along this edge that have some stiffness to it. So when you tie the laces tight, this is of course going to depend a lot on the shape of your foot as well as your ankles. You can find that along the side here, it does dig into the side of your ankle at least just a little bit, not to the point where I had any major discomfort or blistering, but again, it's something that I noticed, and that's not something that I think you should be feeling on a pair of football boots that, again, is nearly $200, especially when we know that they can do so much better. And then as far as the insole is concerned, it is fully removable and a pretty big upgrade over most pro tier takedown models from Adidas, where effectively they've given us the same insole as the Elite model, which is really cool to see. Solid black foam with that new power spine graphic. It's also a little bit thicker than what you'll find from most football boot insoles. And then of course, a really soft kind of microfiber lining material on the surface. It's not an outstanding insole in the grand scheme of football boots, but considering what Adidas have done in the past with takedown models, and honestly, what you'll get from a lot of boots in and around that mid-tier level price point, this I would say is above average. Moving to the base, just like the rest of the lineup, you're going to find new sole plate and stud pattern tooling, with the sole plate being called their new strike frame. This also includes an external heel counter that does carry over from the Elite model. You also have the power spine reinforcement from the heel flowing into the base of the forefoot, basically a zigzag reinforcement that they claim increases the power of your shot simply by stiffening the sole plate in this section. Does it actually do that? I would say your results may vary. I don't personally see how this would make a difference in that most football boots are pretty stiff through this section. I personally did not experience an increase in shot power, but of course your results may vary. And of course you get that new FG stud pattern, which is the usual layout we're used to seeing from Adidas, but with slightly more aggressive kind of half blade, half conical stud hybrid shapes. Where in comparison to the Elite model, other than the fancier finishing you get on the more expensive variation, there is physically nothing different about the mold itself, at least that I can tell. And even from a feel perspective, I did not notice a difference. You could maybe make the argument that this one is slightly more flexible through the forefoot than that of the Elite model, but we're talking about such a minor difference that unless you had one on each foot, you would have a really hard time even noticing a difference, if you notice anything at all. So for the most part, even though Adidas haven't really provided us with any specific details to suggest otherwise, I really do think they've given us the Elite sole plate and stud pattern on this first tier takedown model, which again, for Adidas in particular, is pretty unheard of because we're used to getting that top end upper on the pro tier, but then they give us a much stiffer, heavier, and dare I say, sometimes awkward sole plate on the pro to kind of hold it back from stepping on the toes of the more expensive top end variation. Adidas, thankfully though, have not done that this time around with the Pred 26. In other words, the sole plate feels excellent, as good as what you'll find on the top end model in my experience, and I think also an improvement over Pred 24 and Pred 25. Not just the pros. Compared to the pros, this is a giant leap forward, but I do think this is better than the Elite variations as well. The redesign as a whole just feels a little bit more solid and maybe a little bit smoother underfoot, that I think in some ways is more Predator-like, which is obviously a good thing, but also kind of disappointing in that the upper couldn't be less Predator-like, particularly on this pro variation. And then as far as the FG stud pattern is concerned, like I said, they've made it a little bit more aggressive, but it really isn't a night and day difference from a traction perspective. If you've worn an Adidas boot with this layout at any point over the last 15 years or so, you kind of know what to expect from this new design. More or less, more of the same. And then there's the weight, where I think it's always interesting to see how a takedown model compares to the top end one, especially when you're talking about a pro tier option. So we're obviously going to compare the weight of these two boots, but I also like to compare last year's model, which in this case was the Predator 25 Pro FT, which was not a lightweight boot. So credit where it's due, Adidas have made some major gains in terms of weight savings with this new model. We're gonna weigh them all in the same size, 9.5 US, starting with last year's outgoing variation. This weighs in at 10.1 ounces, the equivalent of 286 grams, where granted, it's a takedown model. You don't expect it to be as light as the top end one, but it's not a lightweight boot at all. Then we have the new Predator 26 Pro FT, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.2 ounces, the equivalent of 204 grams, which is significantly lighter, and in general, basically speed boot light, which isn't that surprising considering the construction, but pretty good for the price. And then we have the Elite model, which you can see weighs in at 7.3 ounces, the equivalent of 207 grams. So not only does the Pred 26 Pro save an enormous amount of weight over last year's variation, it even saves an extra 3 grams over the current top-end Elite model, probably because it doesn't have any rubber elements, but that's besides the point. What you need to know here is that for $170, you're getting a very lightweight pair of football boots. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, again, there's not a huge difference here between the pros and the Elites. The upper is still super thin. It does have, like I said, a little bit more pliability out of the box, but after 20 minutes of wear or so, it's almost impossible to tell a difference. In general, it has that kind of firmer, more structured, dare I say, stiffer feel with the laces tied tight that relates less to the Predator line, especially the previous generations with the Hybrid Touch 2.0 synthetic, and more to kind of the thin synthetic uppers that you have on the Adidas F50 series. The fit in general is a little bit different though, not because the shaping has changed, but typical of so many Adidas takedown models, they're just a little bit shallower in terms of their fit, where the base width is identical from what I can tell. It even has the newer shaping in the toe box and forefoot area, which is a little bit wider and I think is hugely improved. But from top to bottom, it just is slightly more shallow, pretty well all the way through, which does make them fit just a smidge tighter in the same size. It's not as bad as what we've had in the past with Adidas takedown models, where sometimes they're so shallow, especially through the heel, where it almost feels like your heel's gonna pop out of the shoe. Not the case here. I actually, again, do like the heel construction. It is still a little bit shallower than the Elite, but for the most part, the lockdown with the laces tied tight is pretty decent. And as far as the overall feel of the boot is concerned, they don't come across as a takedown. It very much does feel like a high-end shoe, but like I said, it doesn't also feel like much of a Predator given the raw, thin synthetic that these are constructed from. Where from a comfort perspective, I definitely wouldn't classify them as uncomfortable, but certainly if you do not like a stiffer, more structured feel to your football boots and you like to have that little bit of softness, these are probably not going to be your cup of tea. In that regard, they are very different from the Pred 24 and 25 that they replace. As far as width and sizing is concerned, despite a little bit of extra width and volume in the forefoot and toe box area compared to the previous generation, in general, this is still not a particularly wide football boot, especially now that it has this more structured kind of plasticky feeling upper that of course gives a little bit as you wear them in, but in general is not going to stretch a ton, where if you don't like that stiffer feel, in general, these probably won't be the most comfortable to you, but particularly if you have wide feet, these are going to squeeze your foot perhaps very uncomfortably. So if you have wide feet, I don't think these are a great option, but if you've worn past Predator variations, particularly the 24 and 25, and didn't mind the width of those boots, these are going to be very similar. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these boots in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, just like past Predator models, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, it's pretty simple. If you like the idea of the top end F50 Elite in that it's a thin, raw feeling synthetic upper that has a little bit more structure to it in a package that is overall very lightweight, but you prefer the look and nostalgia of the Predator with its fold over tongue, look no further than the Predator 26 Pro FT, because it's basically an F50 in disguise. And for roughly $100 less than you'd pay for an F50 Elite, at least at full retail. Would I personally pick these over a normal F50 Elite? Probably not, but all that to say that despite the way that these football boots look, there is very little about them left in terms of the fit, feel, and overall experience that is truly Adidas Predator. Where don't get me wrong, it's not a bad football boot, and if you like the idea of the Predator 26 Elite and honestly could care less about a couple pieces of rubber on the inside of the foot, then by all means save the money and go for the Pro over the Elites. They're probably not what I would buy for in and around $200. Again, Adidas's own Copa Icon 2 at 180 bucks, I think is a much better football boot, albeit very different in terms of fit and feel though, so it does depend on what you're looking for. But I guess the long story short here is if you are planning on buying these because you want an Adidas Predator, you might be a little bit disappointed on the lack of Predator that these actually have on offer.